welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dan Sutter with the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. College football is king in Alabama and a way of life across much of the South. Yet the economics and business of college football is in the midst of significant and in many ways unprecedented changes. What exactly is changing and how might these changes affect the game that so many Alabamians love? Here to discuss the changing economic landscape of college football is Dr. Fred Green, a professor of Troy University's School of Hospitality, Sport, and Tourism Management. In addition to doing research on such fascinating topics like college football rivalries and fan attendance, Dr. Green also serves as Troy University's faculty representative to the NCAA, and thus is in a unique position to offer insight on these changes. Welcome to the show, Fred.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's just get started here with, I guess, probably with the most visible change here in 2014 in college football, and that's the new playoff system that we have.
All right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we have the new playoff system where there's a selection committee that will select the final 4 playoff teams, and they'll play in semifinals as part of the bowl structure, and then there'll be a championship game the following week. So that's new from the BCS, where they just selected the 2 teams to play in the championship. So now it's a playoff of 4.
And these other games are going to have some tie-ins with the other conferences, like I guess the 6.
Well, there'll be, as you say, 6 games that are the New Year's Day or the big games, and from that are the 2, the semifinals, and then 4 other bowl games, and they've selected I guess locations for these as Dallas and Atlanta, New Orleans, Phoenix, and Miami, which were previously bowls that were involved. I guess the addition would be the Cotton Bowl and what formerly known as the Chick-fil-A Bowl, but now the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl in Atlanta.
Going back to the old name.
Yes, back to the old name.
So, and with this new extra, I guess the extra playoff game or the extra championship game on top of the semifinal games, there's going to be substantial more additional television revenue involved with this, right?
The new contract certainly is substantially more revenue. Now, how much of it trickles down to schools like Troy and the so-called other 5, we're not quite sure yet, but certainly the Big 5, which is the Big 10, Southeastern Conference, the ACC, the Pac-12, and the Big 12, substantial increase in revenue from the television contract.
And there is like one of those extra spots in one of these bowl games is reserved for the top of the remaining 5 conferences, right?
That is correct. One position, so one of those 6 games, one of the New Year's Day games, will be the top finisher from the other 5, which I guess just for record's sake is the Sun Belt, the American Athletic Conference, the Mountain West Conference, the Mid-American Conference, and Conference USA.
So they've sort of, in part, institutionalized the BCS Buster structure to some extent, right?
Definitely.
But there are a lot of other things going on here besides the new playoff system, and one of which is there was a recent lawsuit that was, at least had the initial decision this last summer, led by Ed O'Bannon, a basketball player from UCLA, and a number of other former players that were suing the NCAA over an antitrust case and related to possibly paying the players. What was involved with that?
Well, it's ongoing as it's been appealed by the NCAA, but this O'Bannon and the group that was represented wanted to receive revenue for their likeness. As part of the video games and that type of thing, their likeness was projected and they wanted to have some revenue from this, and they almost certainly will receive some sort of revenue. I don't know how that's going to be distributed, that type of thing. We'll get into several of those other matters as well.
And so that might be yet another source of changing economics here in this, right?
Absolutely, Dan. I think that, there's going to be a sharing of revenue somehow from, it's not going to simply be to each of the schools. The players are going to receive some of this.
And on top of this, this last spring, there was an effort at Northwestern University to try to form a union for their football players to form a union, and that was allowed to go forward by the National Labor Relations Board. I guess that effort's still ongoing, right? But it's another piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely, another piece. And while that's ongoing, I don't know that sometimes I think the people representing the players for the union, if you are part of the union and you're receiving, such as Northwestern, perhaps $60,000 in income, suddenly you take tax considerations into effect, and your tax bracket's gone up quite a bit. So I continue to see that while that's ongoing, I don't know how successful that is going to be.
At least on the surface, that's very much changing how we would be thinking of the player.
Oh, absolutely.
From student athletes to, I mean, we normally would think of unions representing employees, and that's probably a pretty big difference.
You are correct, Dan. Absolutely. I mean, that's going to be a huge difference in how we look at things.
And it could probably affect a lot of other things just beyond their playing, even conceivably like medical coverage and.
Well, I think that's what the players are saying, and that's the main thing, is the players want to be covered, putting their lives at risk, so to speak, and you see continual concussions and the various kinds of medical situations, and they want this to be not only taken care of initially, but taken care of long term as possible loss from a concussion, a possible loss of revenue where they no longer have ability to play. So we see their point.
Now, on top of this, and we've also, the NCAA, within their internal governance, passed a resolution regarding, I guess they were calling it autonomy for like the Power 5 conferences for at least in football this last summer. And I think you were involved in that. So
we were
tell us a little bit about this.
What that will do, I guess in a nutshell, is the Power 5 conferences will have the autonomy to basically add whatever cost it is for cost of attendance. So the players will receive a stipend in addition to their scholarship and their other aid that they've already received, the books and that type of thing, room and board. But in addition to all of that, they will receive a possible stipend from the various universities. And I think the catch here is that there's such a difference, and they're trying to, that's where the issue's coming right now. They're trying to come up with some sort of even amount that they can pay across the board, and there's a huge difference between every school. Like, for example, UCLA and USC, one might be able to, full cost of attendance at UCLA might be several $1,000s more than full cost of attendance at USC, and suddenly that is a recruiting advantage for the school that can say to a player going in their living room, say, well, I can offer you, several $1,000s more than the competitor. So that's going to be ongoing as I think we determine what's going to happen with that. And then if you want to go into the other 5, we basically don't know exactly what we're going to do, although we're going to do something. We're going to cover cost of attendance. But Alabama and Florida had already stated recently that because of this, the new autonomy, that they were projecting that they were going to spend at least $2 million more on food for student athletes. Now, I don't know if Troy University can afford $2 million more just for food alone for student athletes. So we'll have to see how that kind of works out.
So how exactly would this cost of attendance work? Because the students are currently getting their tuition paid for, and they're getting their room and board paid for. So would this be to cover any extra expenses or travel?
That is correct.
Back and forth
some travel back and forth, some help of some additional travel for some of the families to come to some of the games. They used to call it 50 years ago laundry money type thing, just to, extra little spending money kinds of things, and that's where there's such a discrepancy that they haven't really come up with, what's a firm number that we can give across the board.
And there is some equity issues involved with some of because many of the student athletes are from very poor families, and they could be at college, and if their teammates or schoolmates are just going out to a movie, or if they have to travel home for a family emergency, like an illness or a death in the family. I mean, those can be very, very substantial expenses for a student athlete who's from a poorer family. Right?
Absolutely, and that's why this is a good thing. I mean, because ultimately this will help that student athlete. But I think that the concern is, in Title IX states that all student athletes need to be treated the same, and you're talking about 450 student athletes across the board. So you're not just, they talk about, well, football bringing in revenue. Well, you're not just saying, well, we're going to take care of the football team. You've got to take care of every student athlete equally to meet Title IX concerns. So that's a factor that has to be addressed.
And then finally, another of the events, things that are changing is, I'm sure fans around here are familiar with the launch of the SEC network this last fall, and before that, there's been the Big Ten network launched a few years ago, and the Pac-12 now has a network, although that's pretty hard to find their games anywhere. And even the University of Texas has started their own Longhorn network. So we've seen a proliferation of these new cable or satellite networks tied to the conferences, or in one case an actual school. That's sort of a new part of the whole process here.
I think that's going to continue. I mean, that television seems to drive most everything economically as far as college football is concerned. I think you'll continue to see growth in that area. Us as faculty and faculty athletic reps, we're concerned with while we love the economics, we want to bring in more revenue to the school and certainly help the student athletes get some of that. We're concerned about the travel time and some of the time for some of the games, when all of a sudden you're having games at 11:30 on a Tuesday night to meet television schedules. And how does that affect the students and the overall student well-being of, like, missing out on sleep, missing out on being able to get to class and those kinds of things. So yeah, I continue to see that as a battle. Right now the Sun Belt, we had to move a meeting next week because of the fact that the following week, one of our meeting was originally scheduled for the following week, but a couple of our teams are playing on a Tuesday night, and Troy's played in the past on a Tuesday night, and basically you play when television wants you to play, and while it's great exposure for our university because we're the only other, might be no other games on at that time. The student athlete, I've asked a number of our student athletes how they feel about that, and they're not that thrilled with, getting back at 5:30 in the morning on Wednesday and supposedly being in class at 8. So those are some issues that are ongoing as far as that's concerned. As we said, we love the exposure, the revenue, those kinds of things, but at what expense?
And a part of that as well has been the conference realignment in the recent years that have led to at least some conferences, at least temporarily, moving well beyond sort of any kind of local traditional geographical boundaries.
That continues to be an issue. Look at all of the other teams. Now, most of the time football charters a jet and it's not quite as big of an issue, but look at teams from West Virginia in the Big 12, formerly West Virginia, a Big East school, now in the Big 12, and let's say their teams have to face Texas Tech and Lubbock. That's quite a hike, and those kinds of things become big issues. We were actually glad in the Sun Belt. We loved them as a conference member. Denver was a former conference member in the Sun Belt, and they moved out to the WAC conference, and we were happy for our student athletes and their student athletes just because they didn't have to travel as far.
And in some of the conference realignments, we have schools that are only playing football with, for instance, our Sun Belt members in Idaho and New Mexico are only playing football, I think. So.
Well, and actually, we as Sun Belt administrators voted against Idaho and New Mexico State for all membership just simply because of that. The faculty, we've made a strong statement that we can't see our volleyball team having to go to New Mexico and Idaho every year, and and all of our teams. I just used volleyball as an example, but just the prohibitive travel time, and missing out on not only the hardship of the travel to the student, but missing out on certainly a lot of class time. So we voted that yes, they could be admitted in football, but only football.
Right. So there's not necessarily quite as much travel on some of these conferences because there are football teams in there that aren't in there for other sports.
When it's just football, then yeah, it's not quite as bad because you're only talking about one game in a week versus, for example, volleyball might play 3 different matches in a week. Basketball might play 3 to 4 in a week, so you're talking about a much less travel time.
So, as an economist, when we look at things that are happening, my next natural question then to ask, well, how is this going to, how are these events that are going to affect the bigger picture? And I think certainly, as college football fans, there are a lot of things that fans might be interested in terms of how this is going to affect. But I mean, certainly one of the things I think I'm reasonably confident that it's going to a change that's going to come out of all of this is student athletes look to be winners out of all of these changes that are going on, right?
I think that you're correct, Dan. I think that, and that's what the universities are working on right now, and trying to get some of the revenue back to the student athlete and help the student athlete at least to be able to, reap some of the rewards for the hard work that they put in.
But one of the issues then is when economists study the NCAA, the sports economists who like to study the NCAA, they like to describe the NCAA as a cartel, and the main purpose of this cartel is to help keep the salaries of the their employees or their student athletes set at zero to avoid having to pay players explicitly. And some of these things, especially with the antitrust case and the EA Sports O'Bannon antitrust case and some of the cost of attendance compensation, are you starting to get pretty close to paying students or paying some of the players, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think one thing we need to, remember is that the NCAA is us. It's Troy University, it's University of Alabama, it's University of Florida. We are the members of the NCAA, so it's not some, board somewhere that's trying to keep us down, so to speak. I mean, it's what we as institutions that work together decide works best. Getting back to your question as far as the students are concerned, yeah, I don't want to go there. I think that the student athlete, I still think there's a value in scholarship, being a faculty member and the education and those kinds of things. And I believe that they should receive cost of attendance and certainly maybe a small stipend. But beyond that, I think that you're opening up a real can of worms if, how much is this player worth versus let's say, for example, the reserve on the soccer team I guess she's really not worth that much to the university. Is that unfair to the, versus the star quarterback on the football team? Is he worth $50,000 and she's worth $1,000? I don't know. I think that's a slippery slope we don't want to go down.
And there are also legal issues involved with Title IX, which you mentioned earlier, but some of our viewers might not be familiar with that phrase. So if you could explain a little bit about Title IX and how this might affect some of the changes going on and overall cost of college athletics.
Well, Title IX is basically the law of the land that says that there has to be equal opportunities for men and women within all opportunity, but certainly public institutions and all of the NCAA institutions. And so with that in mind, that means that reserve soccer player has to have every opportunity for the same amount of income as the star football player. It can't just be whatever given by specific sports.
And so some people voice concerns about whether some schools can afford their athletics programs, that many schools' athletics programs are a financial drain. They're maybe being covered up by some fees that are being put on students and transferred, and that some of the athletic programs aren't making money or losing money. And if anything, then some of these changes, especially if they get pushed on to other schools that have to provide compensation or cost of attendance to their athletes, might and then for the non-revenue generating sports, in addition to just say football or basketball, that it could seriously compromise whether some schools can afford big time athletics.
I think you're correct. I just read an article this morning talking about that there's basically only 128 FBS schools, the top division, which Troy is a part of, even as the other 5. But of that 128 schools, only 20 that actually break even or with their revenue, so in their athletic department. So those 20, it's okay for those, but the other 108 that are in that group are having to come up with the money from somewhere. And as you suggest, sometimes it's the hidden student fee, which is very unfair. I know as a student, and I'm sure students currently didn't like all of the fees that, what is this paying for type of thing. It's always the question that the student wants, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
So, but somewhere Troy University has to, if cost of attendance comes in, that has to be part of our budget. And we're not able to cover that with the revenue from the athletic department. So it's got to come from somewhere.
Certainly for the power conferences, one of the things with some of these new television contracts, that's certainly changing the economics of being a member of the SEC or the Big 12 or the Pac-12 relative to the Sun Belt Conference members and the smaller 5 conference members. So, how much money are some of these schools in the power conferences getting from all of these different their television contracts?
Well, we don't have exact figures on television contracts. I mean, we're talking about several $100 million for this latest television contract that's divvied up among all. And even as the Sun Belt, we're still receiving more than we did with the BCS contract. But I'll give you an example. This morning I looked at that article, and the University of Alabama's athletic revenue is, well, I guess net revenue is $165 million. So it's quite a substantial amount that's going to some of the major schools.
And I think I was reading today some the numbers around for like the Big 10 schools. They're getting somewhere around $25 to $30 million a year from their television contracts.
Roughly, that's correct. And so the SEC, it's similar. So you're talking about probably from the television contract alone in the neighborhood of $20 to $25 million. And
that's, I believe it's more than like the Troy athletic budget altogether, right?
You are correct. Our entire athletic budget is about that range. So
yeah. So I guess as a lifelong fan myself, I mean, one of the bigger issues that a lot of these changes raise is the question of competitive balance, because when economists study sports leagues, you immediately realize that they're a little bit different than a lot of normal businesses, in that if you're running the New York Yankees or the Dallas Cowboys or Alabama Crimson Tide, you need teams to play. The relevant, in effect, the firm here can't survive on its own. They have to have other teams to play, and at some level, they have to have good teams worthy of a challenge to play, both to interest the fans and then to have if you're going to win a championship, you want to celebrate victory over other good schools, not just people who couldn't have possibly challenged you. So you have this important question of competitive balance and whether all of these changes are going to undermine the competitive balance in college football. What do we think? What do you think might happen there?
Well, I worry as you do, and I agree. That's kind of the beauty of sport, is that they're not going to go see too many inter-squad games and pay big money, or they want to see the opposition. So you have to not only beat your opposition, but you got to keep your opposition in there so they can play you. And that's kind of where we are right now with the Troy Universities of the world, the Boise States of the world, the programs that have beaten some people and got the name out. The public loves that, the upset, the underdog winning some of these games. I don't know exactly how this is going to affect it. I think it's definitely a worry that it could take some of the competitive balance away, that if it makes it just nearly impossible for a Troy University to have a chance to beat an Oklahoma State like we did a few years ago, or a Missouri like we did a few years ago, then the fans aren't going to be maybe as interested. If they say, they still have Troy University on their schedule, but there's no possible way they could ever beat them.
And I think that is a issue as well, because we've seen some of the BCS Buster Schools, the Boise States of the world, TCU and Utah, before they joined other conferences, that were quite successful, that they were making it 2 BCS bowl games and beating teams from the power conferences. I mean, TCU finished second in the final rankings before they joined the Big 12. So I mean, we've had some teams outside of the power conferences that have been very on the verge of almost breaking through and getting to the championship game, certainly competing in a top 5 level. And I mean, I guess there's a real question whether that's going to be able to continue.
Well, although the revenue and disparity in the revenue continues to be an issue, at this point there hasn't been, and all of the schools voted adamantly that there wasn't going to be an increase in scholarships. Mm-hmm. So as long as they keep the scholarships the same, the bottom line is the kids want to play, and so there's only so many players that they can have at Alabama, and some are going to, the ones that aren't going to get to play at Alabama are going to come to Troy. Right. And so while I worry a little, I think as long as they keep that scholarship. Now, if all of a sudden they give them 150 scholarships, then we're in trouble. Then forget it, because they're gonna take every one of the scholarships, and that's going to be, right now it's at 85, and so every one of those scholarships will go to kids that would come to Troy. But as long as we have the scholarships, the kids want that opportunity to play, and I think they kind of relish that role sometimes, that underdog mentality where we have a chance to beat the big boys.
And the recruiting's occurring when the kids are 16 or 17 years old, and a lot of development occurs between 16 and then 20 or 21 when the kids are actually out there playing on the field. So if there seems to have been a scope for the coaches at a place like Boise State to be able to know who they're trying to recruit and recruit well and still recruit some quality players, because Boise and TCU and some of those other teams have certainly produced a lot of players who've gone on to play in the NFL. So they've been able to in the past get some good recruits.
And I think that's us. We've been able to as well. Marcus Ware is an example. He's a future Hall of Famer in the NFL. That was a little bit small. Maybe sometimes they're a little bit slow. Maybe a little, that type of thing, and kind of grow into these positions as once they get to, as you suggest, Dan, when 16, 17 coming out and being recruited, maybe not quite that big at that point, and then grow into the position, and I hope that there'll continue to be those opportunities for those student athletes at Troy University or Boise State or one of those type of institutions.
So just in wrapping up here, I know we've in the past become pretty close to having a non-BCS or not one of the non-power conference teams qualify for the BCS championship game. We've now expanded it from 2 to 4 with the semifinal games in addition to the championship game. Do you think there's going to be any chance over the next 5 years or so under the new system of a team from a non-power conference actually qualifying for one of those playoff spots?
I try to be an optimist, but I don't think we have much of a chance. We get in one of those bowls, which is going to be nice. One of our schools will get into one of those 6 bowls. You'll see them on New Year's Day, which will be awesome for the school. But to be selected in one of the 4, I don't think there's much of a chance of that.
Well, our time has come to an end. Thank you very much for coming on with me, and thank you for watching. Join us next time for another EconVersations.